Welcome to our unit on evolution. Hopefully you know that Charles Darwin is the father of evolution. He spent 5 years on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, and he sailed around the world and discovered many organisms. 15,000 species on the Galapagos Islands alone. He also wrote a groundbreaking book called On the Origin of Species, which explained how species changed over time. Here is a picture of his voyage. If you notice, there are a lot of islands on here. He has Tahiti, of course, the famous Galapagos Islands, the Azores, Canary Island, St. Peter's Island and Rock, over here, Cocoas, and then, of course, Australia, a very large island, if you'd like to call it that. So why did he choose islands? Because when species get isolated, they tend to undergo changes more rapidly because they have a set food source. And so if an adaptation is going to be good, they're going to hold on to it. And if an adaptation is poor, then they're going to end up going extinct. So hopefully you remember a little bit about Linnaeus' taxonomy, so you'll know a bit about what a species is. We start up here at kingdom. In the kingdom Animalia, we have animals. Those can be insects or fish, or pandas or bears. Then we come down here. Now we have the phylum Chordata. All of a sudden, anything without a backbone off the island. Now we have Mammalia. Anything that doesn't have the characteristics of a mammal. Does it produce milk? Does it bear live young? Does it have an amniotic sac? Does it have fur? All of those kinds of things are going to be characteristics. Then we have the order Carnivora. In other words, do you eat meat? Down here, are you bear-like? Are you very similarly bear-like, like just your fur color has changed? You have a very similar diet, oftentimes an overlapping range. And then we get to one single animal, the grizzly bear. In other words, Ursus horribilis. Darwin did a lot of observing when he was on the HMS Beagle. He noticed that when he went to the Galapagos Islands, here's a picture of the Galapagos Islands close up, that the species on each of the islands were a little bit different from one another. That each of the species had these very specific adaptations that allowed them to survive on their own island. Let's take a look at one of his most famous items, which would be the finch. There was an ancestral finch. We'll just call him Finch X. Finch X ended up, by one mechanism or another, on a Galapagos island. Maybe he flew there. There's actually a thing called rafting, where large items will band together in the ocean, and they'll actually form a little tiny floating moving island, and sometimes birds will get trapped on them, and they'll actually go so far that they'll wash up on something like the Galapagos Islands, and then that bird will exit and now be a permanent resident. So the birds got there. And there are many different types of environments on each of these islands. Some of the islands had insects. Notice the beak on all of these birds. These are all insect-eating birds. Notice they are each different species from one another. Now we have over here mainly seeds. Look at the bulkiness of the beaks here. Then you have a lot of cacti and cacti parts on these islands. And on a very small number of islands, you have budding bushes or trees that produce fruits. And each of these beaks looks different and allows these birds to feed best on the island they live on. It would be very unlikely that these birds, even if they made their way to this island, that they would be able to outcompete this particular type of vegetarian finch. Here's another one, the land tortoise. Look at each of them. Look at the length of their necks. Isn't it obvious that this guy is maybe a browser and a forager, that he lives on an island where there's going to be bushes, that he needs to raise his neck up and be able to bite off those taller bushes? Look at him. Clearly, his food source is closer to the ground. And then over here, he needs a little bit of both. He's going to have some ground food sources and some higher up food sources. These are adaptations. Natural selection. So Darwin had a theory, and the theory had many parts. Natural selection is only one of them. What it means is that if you have animals that are living in a given area, if one animal has a tiny variation that makes it able to get mates, to survive, to be larger, to have a bigger territory, he's going to pass on his genes, or she's going to pass on her genes to the next generation. So you can see the little joke here about the beaver that has to cut the tree down and the beaver that gets a hand that's actually a chainsaw. The bottom line on all of this is those who can't die. Those who can survive. Artificial selection. Now, when we get things and we put them under human pressure, artificial selection happens. And we've done this with pretty much every food item that you see in the grocery store. Do we want little tiny skinny corn? No, we want to maximize the corn that grows on a plant, because remember, each corn stalk only grows one corn cob, so we want the maximum amount of corn per cob. Big fat kernels that breed well and that are delicious. Classic example. This is what they used to look like. This is Canis lupus. These are all Canis domesticus. Look at the unbelievable variations that 10,000 years of human pressure on selective breeding has produced. Survival of the fittest. Who's the best hunter? Who has the best territory? Who has the most beautiful structures that when they do their mating dance, the females like them the best? Who is able to bear the best offspring? These make you the survival of the fittest. This means your genes go forward. And let me tell you, with Darwin's evolution, we're going to talk about it in a lot of ways, but the bottom line is putting your genes forward is the number one thing. I like to make a joke about myself that my parents put an unbelievable amount of effort into me. I'm fairly good on the survival of the fittest. I'm bright. I don't have any genetic abnormalities. I am perfectly able to bear young. I'm educated. I know what the dangers are in the world, but I am never going to have offspring. I am a genetic dead end. And so, as Darwin would say, basically, I have selected against myself, which is something that animals in the wild don't do. So in the wild, if you are the fittest, you survive, you pass on your genes. Evidence for evolution, there's a lot of it. Fossil evidence, we're going to look at pictures in a moment. So I'll skip over this for just a second. How do we know how old they are? Two ways: relative dating. Where are they physically located in the rock record? Absolute dating. We take a rock, we scrape it, we look for carbon-14 or other radioactive elements. The more there are, the younger it is. The less there are, the older it is. The problem is that absolute dating has a shelf life. We don't really need to know what that is. In other words, if an animal dies, there's only so long for those half-lives to happen. If the half-lives have all passed and there's no more carbon-14, let's say, then we go to relative dating. Here are some pictures of fossils. There are 5 main types. Petrified. In other words, the organism has been encased in rock but has dissolved away, mold and cast. Carbon film, it's just left behind this shadow. Trace fossils, dinosaur stepped there, that fossil was preserved. Preserved remains. Amber is one of the most common ways, but we also have things like ice and rock. Homologous structures. Similar anatomical features shared between multiple species that are not in any way that are related. So in other words, humans, monkeys, like chimpanzees and gibbons, all have very similar palm structures. Why? Because we had a common distant ancestor. Horses, humans, cats, bats, bird, whales, they all have this very similar bone structure. Why? Because we all had a common ancestor, and not that long ago. Because remember, what are we all? We're all mammals. That puts us pretty far down the taxonomic tree. Now, analogous structures. In other words, they look the same, but our ancestors are really, really far back. Think how different a bat, a mammal, is from a butterfly, which is an arthropod, from a bird, which is avis. These are really, really similar looking things. They all allow these animals to fly. But the bat, the butterfly, and the bird are not very closely related. Back to the homologous structures. The bat, the mouse, the human, all mammals, much more closely related. Vestigial. These are structures that have disappeared and are no longer necessary. We know that most of us don't have a tail, but at one point in our genetic history, we did. Most of us know that whales were once on land. These are their hind legs. They've basically gone down to this teeny tiny structure that's up inside the whale, no longer visible from the outside. Maybe you know about your appendix. Your appendix is a vestigial structure. You still have it, but there's no use for it. Embryonic structures. During their developmental stages, the earlier we look back, the more similar some really, really different species look. This means that probably way, way, way back in our evolutionary history, we were the same animal and we've diversified or changed from there. Look how similar fish, salamander, tortoises, chickens, hogs, pigs, rabbits, and human all look. Very, very similar, much more diverse as we become almost ready to be born. Biochemical evidence. In other words, if we look inside our cells, if we look at our genetic material, we have a lot of similarities, leading us to the idea that we came from one thing and then we spread out to fill in all of the niches of the world. Transitional species. We know that there are some species that look a bit like a dinosaur slash reptile, but that have wings and feathers. This is a crossover between a reptile becoming a bird, or basically a dinosaur becoming a bird. Bacterial evolutionary evidence. Hopefully this makes sense in our current day and age. Bacteria evolve really, really quickly. So we can see they're becoming resistant to something like antibiotics in a very short period of time. Think about MRSA. MRSA does not react very well to our antibiotics. It survives and breeds. That's pretty much it. Hope that you enjoyed evolution. It's probably one of my favorite chapters. And so Darwin all the way down to MRSA, we watch how things change incredibly quickly, usually not in a human lifespan unless you breed on a very short time scale.